Nazism, fascism, socialism, environmentalism, communism, Marxism, Leninism. What are all of these various isms? Today we'll explore what lies behind these ideologies. This is Anarchy in America with Christian Gomez. For those of you who have followed the John Birch Society since the 1960s, you may recall the film This is the John Birch Society, narrated by G. Edward Griffen. He discussed the communist smear tactic that the communists used to discredit and neutralize their opposition. Here's a brief excerpt.
In 1943, the following directive was issued from party headquarters to all communists in the United States. It read, "When certain obstructionists become too irritating, label them after suitable build-ups as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic, and use the prestige of anti-fascist and tolerance organizations to discredit them. In the public mind, constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind."
Compare that to everything that's going on today. Joining us to discuss this and more is G. Edward Griffen. Mr. Griffen, thank you for being with us here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Christian. It's really an honor to be here.
It's an honor to speak with you, the legend himself, Mr. Griffen. So let's get right into it. From your personal experience and observation of studying Marxism-Leninism, what has been the most effective or dangerous communist smear tactic that you've observed?
Well, I think it's the standard one that fits the Marxist-Leninist strategy, the one with the most punch to it in terms of the terrain, meaning in terms of the nationality or the geographical area where it's being used. And in America, it's racism. I think that they settled on that long ago when they wrote documents on it and held classes on it and published textbooks on it. So they figured that the best way to divide America was along racial lines. And so that has been the one they've used the most. But back in the early days, they weren't so easy about doing that because they hadn't gained much momentum on it. And like so many of these tactics, the first time they begin is kind of fresh and it's strange and people don't pay much attention to it. It's the repetition and the incessant repetition that gives it any kind of a authenticity because people hear it so often. I think it was Adolf Hitler, wasn't it, that said if you tell a lie often enough and repeat it enough times with enough emphasis, people will gradually just believe it because of the repetition. So I would say it was racism, and that's the one they still use. It's a fallback.
In fact, when you see these Antifa and Black Lives Matter rallies, what are they always chanting? They're always chanting Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, say her name, say his name, and of course we see them saying no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA, incessantly like a broken record. And the more people hear that, some don't buy into it, fortunately, but others, they hear it so often that they take that as gospel truth. And this was the case back in the 60s also, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely true. But as I said, that it was just beginning then, so it hadn't been heard quite so often. But anyway, these people are master psychopoliticians or psychomanipulators, and they know how the culture works. They know how the human mind works, and of course, we all know it. I mean, there are textbooks on these things. It's not that they're such geniuses. You can read about these things in college textbooks, but they're the ones that have weaponized this knowledge. They're the ones that have utilized it. The closest you can come to a counterparty to that would be the advertising industry. I mean, they use the same tactics. They just use slogans over and over and over again until finally it's so ingrained in the subconscious mind that people don't even question its validity, or they certainly don't remember where it came from.
How has the communist smear tactic evolved over all these decades, especially with the role of technology and social media as it stands now? How has the smear tactic adapted itself to these modern technologies and means of communication?
Well, I think you touched on it there, Christian. It's the modern technology, and that's the difference because two things have happened in that transition to modern technology. One is that the media has changed I mean, back in the 60s, of course, there was television and there were radio and there were electronic and that kind of thing and communications. But the digital world hadn't yet really arrived fully, and so we didn't have Facebook, and we didn't have YouTube, and all of those things. We were communicating with the world through our boob tubes and through our speakers on our radios and that kind of thing, but never walking around with a little thing in our hand, focusing on our attention or sitting in front of it like we are now, talking to each other beautifully over a computer connection. So that's what really changed, and of course it amplified everything. It sped everything up. It improved the quality of everything. The communications quality increased tremendously, which made it more convincing because it's immediate and it has a certain freshness to it. It seems real because it's online. It's happening now. So in the old days, as you say, we had to get this all through something that had to be prepared, and it was somewhat delayed. Sometimes you could get live television of an event, but that was usually reserved for baseball games and football games. But when it came to news, it wasn't quite that good. So so now it's not just the printed word or the phrases or the audio side of it or the verbal side of it. It's the vision that you see, the pictures you see, and they are very, very compelling, especially when you realize that they too, even though it's spontaneous, they too are orchestrated. They're created like works of art. People, I think, subconsciously at least know that it's all, not all, but mostly staged. And but they forget it because they keep saying it over and over and over again, as you said, and it's that repetition that is so deadly.
So who would you say is behind staging a lot of the protests and anarchy that's happening right now in our streets?
The WHO are trained members of organizations, and we know them. They're Antifas and the Black Lives Matter, and there are others. Every little community has its own peoples this and peoples that, and so they're organizations. And the people in those organizations, I suppose, I'm going to guess, are probably made up of about 50% ideologues, the kids mostly, the idealistic young high school and college students who really have been influenced heavily by the slogans, and they're very influential. I mean, when I was young, I was influenced by slogans, like the typical the classical Marxist-Leninist slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Didn't that sound great, And fight against racism and war. Well, that sounds great. So, if you don't have much experience in life, and you haven't met too many con artists, you start falling for that stuff real easily. So about half of these people, I think, are very idealistic and nice kids, but they really have been caught up in something that's false, and they don't know it yet. They will eventually, and so they're enthusiastic about supporting it. But the other half are professionals, and I'm not sure about them. And maybe some of them still believe in these slogans, but I think most of them are in it because they see it as a job. They see it as a pathway to a career, so to speak, and to government jobs and government control. I think they see themselves as part of the bureaucracy that's going to control the world. And it seems like it's a heady whine to be part of the machinery that's going to control the world. And so they go to school and they learn tactics and strategies. They study, they have lessons, and they read books and they memorize things, and they go out and practice. And they're the professionals. They're the ones that show up. They all look alike. They're all wearing the black uniforms. They got the hoods, the same boots and everything. Well, that didn't happen accidentally. Somebody bought those things or gave them the money and told them how to order them. And so forth. So they got the professionals, and then, of course, what Stalin used to call the useful idiots. So that they're the front line. But now, who's behind them? Well, obviously, they tell us that there are people who identify themselves as Marxist-Leninists. I think it's significant that when they describe themselves, they usually put those two words together. And that's highly significant because I learned years ago when I was studying all this that there's a big difference between a Marxist and a Marxist-Leninist. The Marxist is just the guy that believes in the ideas of Karl Marx. He's read Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, and he believes it. He's a gung ho. He's a Marxist, and you find a lot of college professors, for example, and teachers who are like that. But the Marxist-Leninists are the people that go one step further. They've read the works of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and now he says something else. He says, "Okay, comrades, you can believe in Marxism all you want to, but our job is not to convince everybody of Marxism, but our job is to come to power. Our job is to seize control of the mechanisms of power. Our job is
Inciting
to
world
get
revolution.
revolution. Let's overthrow the government. Let's kill people. Let's scare people. Let's take over, so we have the power then to execute our will, whether people believe in it or not."
So would you say that Black Lives Matter and Antifa are Marxist-Leninist organizations, and how exactly do they fit into the whole Marxist-Leninist movement overall?
Well, yes, I do. They themselves say that, I believe. I think if you dig deeply enough, you'll find the leaders of all of these organizations who speak quite fondly of Marxism, Leninism. That's not their primary slogan. Of course, they're out yelling against racism, war, and all that kind of thing. But yeah, when you get them off guard, they say, "Oh yeah, we believe in the overthrow of capitalism. The only solution to this is to change the system, bring about communism and Marxism," they sometimes call it. So yeah, that's what's behind it. There's no question about that. But now let's go one step further. What's behind that? And this is where it gets murky and really interesting, and sometimes even our best friends are not aware of that. But if they'll stop and think for a minute, from the very beginning of all of this, the Bolshevik Revolution was financed by the wealthiest people in the world. People but who generally would be considered as capitalists.
Yes,
You
the
know,
Wall Street
Wall Street.
bankers, elites.
Yeah. Yes, from the city in London, the banks of London, and from New York. This is where the money came from. Now, are these Marxist-Leninists? No. Now we have to stop using their words and stop thinking about what are they. Well, we only have a few minutes left. My analysis led me to conclude that underneath all these slogans, there's a thing called collectivism. It's an ideology, and if you peel off the labels of communism, fascism, Nazism, socialism, all of them, whether you're a liberal or progressive or left winger, all the words, you come down to a hardcore philosophy of social political relationships. It is called collectivism. We don't have time for all of it, but the core idea is that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed if necessary for the greater good of the greater number. It's all about numbers. So if you could say you have 51% of the population on your side, you win. You can take all the chips off the table. If you get 51%, this thing called democracy, they love that word, that means you can do anything you want. No question about somebody's rights. I mean, you got 51%. The heck with rights. What does that mean? We won. So you come to that kind of an ideology, and now we find that ideology at the corporate level. Some of the biggest corporations in the world, which we could not call Marxist-Leninist, but who's financing this Marxist-Leninist movement? It's the corporations and the wealthiest people in the world, the banks and things like that. And now this is where we really get to the core of the matter, and that's why the deep state in America, which certainly they have their share of Marxist-Leninists. They get along just fine together. They believe the same thing. But really the hardcore direction in the U.S. is coming from not these Marxist-Leninist groups, but from the tax-exempt foundations and this deep state thing. All these people go around wearing suits and driving around in limousines and flying in jet planes and holding meetings at Davos, Switzerland. The globalists, now we use another word for them. Mm-hmm. Now, they are not Marxist-Leninists, but they are definitely hardcore collectivists. And this is where the whole thing comes together.
This is what you would call pressure from above and below. You have the street agitators that are not that well informed. They might be Marxists, they might be Marxist-Leninists even, and they might be taking orders from the Workers' World Party, let's say, or the Communist Party USA. But above that, the financing behind the so-called Marxist and Leninist organizations is the corporatist, collectivist, deep state organizations, and those are the same people that are in public policy making many of the legislations being promoted on the national and global level through the United Nations and in other countries, right?
Exactly that. And down there at the bottom, this poor manipulated people, most of them have no idea about this. They're yelling and screaming against the people in power, and they don't know that the people in power are the ones that are running their operation. They need them, The whole idea is that we need an enemy. we have to control both sides of the narrative. If we want to change society, we want to make rapid change, we've got to have a crisis. We have to have something that causes fear in the hearts of the people, because they're not going to change unless they're scared of losing their lives or there's something precious. So our job is to control both sides and to create conflict. So they create conflict, they control both sides. And this is the hardest thing for the average student to understand, that regardless of which side of this thing they're on, they're serving that purpose.
And many people are afraid, whether it's COVID-19 that has them on edge, or the Black Lives Matter revolutions in the street. You can name a whole host of things, the fabricated environmental crisis and so forth. So what would you say to the average American that is maybe watching this video? What should they do? What do you recommend that they do to stay not just educated, but to educate others and to be involved in this fight for freedom on the global level?
Well, you nailed it right there, Christian. The first step is to understand what's going on. If we fall for the false paradigm of left versus right, for example, if we fall for that, if we don't understand that these people control both sides of most narratives, if they look at the political system and they say, well, here's a good guy and there's a bad guy. How do we know he's a good guy? Well, because look at the bad guys. They all hate him, right? Therefore, he's a good guy. No, wait a minute. Look deeper than that. And you'll find out that usually both sides of this conflict are really moving in the same direction. So the first thing is people have to understand that. They have to clear the cobwebs out of their system, out of their brains, and understand, oh, this is trickier than I thought. It's not just a question of who you're going to vote for. You're going to be a Republican or a Democrat. No. You lose if that's as deep as you want to go. So the first thing is awareness, education. I hate the word education because it sounds so boring, but it's awareness at least. And without that, nothing happens. But with that, now the next step is you can't just say, well, I read a book and now I get it, and so I win. No. Now you have to get these collectivists out of power, out of positions, because they own the guns, they own the weapons and the engines of coercion. They own the media. They control the school system. They own the health system, and they're going to try and poke needles in all of us in a few months to dumb us down or make sure the population diminishes or whatever they have in mind. People have to be aware that we're in a battle for our very existence. And so that's the first step. And then they have to get active and do something about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffen. We're glad to have you today and share this information with us. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me.
G. Edward Griffen is exactly right. Education and action are the double-edged sword needed to stop this menace of collectivism. The communist smear tactic is ultimately a collectivist tool to discredit and neutralize the opposition.